Okay, we get started. Which one's first? Is it fire?
Yeah, more than
Oh,
that.
just one? Oh, okay. Okay, we are gonna go ahead and get started. It's just after 5 o'clock. Make sure we have plenty of time, for this workshop for, if I could pull this, grab this real quick. This is to review a proposed bond financing plan. Raylan or Chief, who's kicking it off? Perfect.
So we have our municipal advisors, Michael Keith and Sean Kelly from Zion's Bank, here to talk about what we've been meeting about with our bond planning. And so I'm going to turn it over to them because they are the experts.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And if you don't mind just stating your name, when you come up, so we know who is speaking, we appreciate that.
You bet. No, thank you, council members. Pleasure to be here with you guys this evening and kind of talk about this. I'm Michael Keith. I'm kind of head of our Idaho Public Finance Office here, and as Raylan had pointed out, we've been hired as the city's financial advisor to kind of help you guys navigate financing the bond from the election. So you guys got the hard part done. You got the bond passed. Now we get to go out and try to get the funds to build the project. And so what we thought we would do tonight is I wanted to be able to just kind of walk through kind of the process we're going to go through, the financing itself, allow council to kind of interact with us a little bit, ask questions from us about the process, make sure you guys understand, and then kind of what are those key points, what are those key kind of dates and things that we're going to be doing. What are the points that the council will need to kind of, weigh in on this process as we kind of work through city administration on putting this together, and and I've got kind of a timeline we can talk through on that. And then of course my colleague behind me, Sean Kelly, works with me in our offices downtown as well. So what I wanted to do is visit a couple things. I want to talk about roles and responsibilities so you kind of understand who we are, some of the major players in doing a bond issuance is. I know that the Urban Renewal has done bonds before. It's probably been a while for the city's done them. They've done some LIDs in the past. But so just make sure we kind of understand what those are, how we price bonds, what drives the rate, which is your borrowing cost, right, for these, and what kind of a sell method we're choosing, and kind of what that means for the city. And then we've got some preliminary schedule and key dates that we'll go over with you guys. We've got an update on kind of some impact information in terms of the cost of what we are going to sell through this issuance. And then we'll talk generally about the municipal interest rate market and where that's at as well. So what are the roles? So as we kind of introduced ourselves as the municipal advisor, kind of what does that mean for you guys? And that means that we have been hired as your fiduciary, right? So you have hired us to kind of help you and guide you and advise you on this municipal financing, bond financing, and really that means we have a fiduciary role to the city that we have to put your interest above ours and help you guys kind of navigate this and make decisions, which includes like bond method of sale, how much, timing, things around IRS rules and other stuff that we need to navigate as a city when we're issuing tax exempt debt. The other folks that are working on this transaction with us are bond counsel, right? So this is your special counsel, so not your general counsel that the city has, but special counsel that's a bond lawyer that can provide a tax-exempt opinion to the market, right? That we are following federal laws, that we're following Idaho state laws for issuing debt in the marketplace, and can provide kind of what's called a bond opinion, which is that tax-exempt opinion which the investors need so they know that their debt's going to be tax-exempt when you guys issue it. They also are going to prepare some of the other legal documents. They helped with the election ordinance that you guys put together for the election. And so they're going to be helping put all the legal documents together, reviewing any of the information that we help put together, and we'll kind of work in tandem with bond counsel. And then, do I need to pause so you guys can get that on?
Yeah, that's right. So we just need to get the TV going again.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I will pause so you guys can get that fixed.
Timed out or... because it was on, so I don't know what Was the back one on also? Did anybody notice? I didn't even see the back one there.
Yeah, go ahead, do what you need to do.
This will be an old problem once we move.
Yes, it will. Most definitely. Okay, there it is.
Thumbs up?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, guys. So the other party to this is the underwriter, and the underwriter's job is to connect us with the marketplace, right? They understand who the investors are. There's a couple different ways to utilize and hire an underwriter, and we'll talk about that in the decision that's kind of been made by the city. And then trustee in this case means kind of a bond finance trustee. And really, again, their job is to make sure that the funds go from the city to the investor, right? And there are going to be multiple investors in here. We'll talk a little bit about that. So how does this all come together, right, when we're trying to figure out how to issue bonds, right? And so I like this graphic because I like to talk about, like, who's giving advice, who's kind of doing the purchaser, and who are some of these kind of third-party folks that are helping the city, right? So you're getting your advice from the advisor and your bond counsel, right? So your legal and financial advice. Then we've got the purchasers, which in this case will be an underwriter that will take the bonds, purchase them effectively from the city, and then resell them into the marketplace. And then kind of some of the other things that we'll talk about are we'll get the bonds rating. So there's a credit rating process that we'll go through for the debt. Because of how well the city has done managing its finances, we won't need to have any additional credit enhancement, and we'll talk about that. And then we kind of talked about the trustees' role, that they take the funds, again, from the city and make sure that those are getting paid to the appropriate investors. So from a high level, what are some of those key dates? So we talked about the rating presentation. So we are working on that right now with city staff. And really, there are three primary rating agencies. There's Moody's, S&P, and there's Fitch. And you don't have to all three, you only have to have one. And really, the one we choose is the one we think that, like, their metrics are going to give us the best opportunity for the best rating. And in this case, in particular, with general obligation-backed debt, Moody's tends to be more favorable towards Idaho credits. And so we're going to head down the road of having a rating done by Moody's Investor Service. And really what that process looks like is we'll put a presentation together of the types of things that they would like to know about the city, and we'll work with staff, and they'll do a presentation with us to one of their credit analysts, and then they take that to a committee, and they provide a rating back. And I've got some scales, and we'll talk about where I think the city's going to land on that. Again, I think there's some really good metrics for how you guys have managed things and the kind of growth you've had here, so I think that's going to be pretty favorable for you guys. In terms of other things, action items for the council to consider is that we will be back May 7th, and bond council will be presenting a bond ordinance, right? And so what that is it's really the contract with the investors, right? What are you covenanting to do, which is levy a tax sufficient to, repay the debt, what kind of the structure of this is going to look like. And there'll be specific parameters in there when the council passes that to allow staff, administration to execute on the transaction, as long as, right, they meet those parameters that the council has set out inside that ordinance. The other thing that we're working on, which is the offering document, which in our world is called the preliminary official statement and ultimately the official statement. That's about a 50, 60-page document that will also come back before the council later and in the schedule for your guys' adoption. And really, that's kind of the credit information, right? We go through the security, how it's going to be repaid, demographics of the city, kind of what's going on. It's not something where we get to boast necessarily about the city. It's kind of more of a black and white type of document, informational document, but it does go into details of the city's tax base, how things are growing, what the need is, why we're doing the project, so the investor can kind of make an informed decision about investing in the city bonds. From there, we kind of move on to May 28th is what we call our pre-pricing call. And really what that is a check-in before we sell bonds. So we're going to lock interest rates, or are planning to lock interest rates on May 29th. So rates float until then, right? Until we get to go to the market and we either sign a purchase contract or do a competitive sell. And so May 28th is our opportunity to kind of check in on the markets. You know, things happen every day. You know, possibly other countries bomb other countries, other things happen. Those things all affect the markets, right, as we're trying to navigate this. And so we want to make sure that we are providing advice to the city of the right timing, right, of whether or not we think if there are any disruptions, are they the type of disruptions where we think, hey, we should kind of, you know, tap the brakes a little bit here and find a better market to sell your bonds in. And we'll help the city navigate that. As I said, 29th is when we'll lock those rates in. June 4th and 5th, final documents will come out. And, you know, bond counsel will be reaching out to city council and staff to sign all the documents that go along with the bond financing. And then June 13th is when we close on the bond. And what that means from the city's perspective is that's when the funds get transferred into your account. And we'll be sitting there to begin spending on the project. Any questions on the schedule before I move on here?
Any questions? Okay.
Okay.
You're good.
Thank you.
so
I
much.
appreciate that so much. So I won't dive too deep into this slide, but on the left-hand side is a front copy of the preliminary official statement. And on that, you'll see it says 11,155,000. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about, you know, why it's that number. Remember, you guys have authorization for 17.3 million in total from your election. We're not selling everything now, and I've got some numbers that we'll dive deeper into, you know, what those numbers are and how we got to that 11,155,000 preliminary number. But again, you can see kind of this document has some legal lease in it, you know, payment structures, general information about the city. And again, it will be ultimately the city's document. You will adopt this. The council will get a chance to see this before it gets circulated to investors. And then we talked about this. Then we'll have the bond ordinance again as the other legal document that will come before the city on May 7th. That's the document that bond counsel will put together, and it's about a 30-page document that will again outline all the covenants, definitions, and things necessary for the investors to understand what their rights are effectively if they invest in the bonds. And same thing for the city. What are you coveting to do as part of this financing? So quickly on this, because I get some questions sometimes about what are some of the things that drive rates, right? And so big thing is markets, right? What are the markets doing? What's supply and demand? Everybody who has followed the markets recently knows that inflation is a big concern, and that's been driving rates somewhat up recently. But we track what's called the MMD, which is called the Municipal Market Data. And really that is the Dow Jones of the municipal bond market, right? It's the index that we use to see which direction interest rates are going. And then credit quality, right? Just like when you get a mortgage, what's my credit score? And that's why we're going before a rating agency, third party, to have the city rating. The higher the rating, the better the interest rates we can ask from investors in the marketplace. You're also helped by the security type, right? So you have the best security someone can ask. You have an unlimited tax pledge, right, from the city and your tax base, which is a very sizable tax base, pledging the bond. So that helps significantly in the credit rating and the interest rates. The other one are market conditions in general, like what's investor demand, what's secondary trading happening, what volume. We talked a little bit about supply and demand. Those things are also drivers, right? And we kind of keep an eye on the market as we're moving through it. Tax status. So again, not from your guys' perspective, from the investor's perspective, you know, are we issuing taxable or tax-exempt bonds? As we said, we're issuing tax-exempt bonds, right? So again, the city can demand lower rates because the investor doesn't have to pay taxes on that investment. And then the structure, right? What does the deal look like in terms of features of the deal? So overall size of the bond. We use this term called coupon, and we'll talk about that. That's really the interest rate that you're going to pay to the investor. Call features, meaning that your ability to refinance or call the bonds in. What does those features look like? All things that drive interest rates and things that we help the city kind of navigate. And then on this graphic, this is how Moody's kind of looks at credit ratings and what they base or the drivers are. And 30% is financial performance. The city's doing great, right? You guys have strong financials, strong performance. You guys are growing. So that's something that's going to look really, really favorable for the city. Economy and tax base, again, something that's growing. You guys just had a big increase, right, because urban renewal had expired and increasing your guys' market value. And so that's something that looks really, really well. Leverage, city doesn't have debt, right? Outside of geo debt and maybe some leases, the city doesn't have a lot of debt, so there's not a lot of leverage. And then institutional framework, all that means is it is what flexibility the city has in the state, right, to borrow and do money. And we know that we have less flexibility, right, than possibly other states, right, in terms of the different mechanisms that we have available to us to finance infrastructure, right? Like if you look at, you know, other states, for instance, on water and sewer bonds, they don't have to go get a vote to do that, but you guys do if you guys wanted to invest in water and sewer infrastructure with bonds. So it's looking at those types of things in terms of what kind of flexibility you guys have, which is only about 10%. I suspect that if you look at this, AAA being the highest, AA being the second category, that the city of Caldwell will be in that AA category, just with the rating metrics that you guys have. So that'll be an excellent rating, and fully expect us to be able to get there. So what does the pre-pricing look like before we head into the market? And so some of the things that we're looking at are, what are some of the key economic releases, right? Is the FOMC meeting, and what do we think is going to happen during that? And what's the expectations, right? The expectation actually had been that the Fed was going to cut rates, meaning that, the overnight rate that they charge banks, kind of the federal fund rate, that they were at some point going to cut those. But because inflation has been persistent in the kind of the federal landscape and the national landscape, they've not done that, right? And so that this recent increase in rates, if you've been following market rates at all, of the Treasury bond, is because of that, right? That the expectation has now changed that because we can't bring inflation down, that the Federal Reserve may have to keep rates longer and higher longer than originally expected. And so that's a driving force. Consumer confidence is something else we look at, housing price index, and then those 2- and 5-year Treasury auction notes too. So that's the other piece of this, right? Again, supply and demand in the Treasury market. As our debt balloons, right, and we got to try to sell that off in the marketplace, those auctions are important, right, when they happen, to see kind of what rate people are willing to buy our debt at, which also can drive markets. And then we'll look at comparable transactions, meaning other things that are priced and sold, and kind of give you guys some direction on where we think the rates will go. And then, pricing goals, like what are we trying to accomplish with this in terms of, proceeds, timing, and some of those things. So let's talk about the sell itself. And as I kind of mentioned at the top of this presentation, there's a couple different ways to sell bonds. One of them is called the negotiated sell. A negotiated sell means that you hire that underwriter that we talked about up front in the transaction. You use their sales force to sell the bonds. Now, the difference is there that you can go through a competitive process to get an underwriter, right, in terms of kind of their fees and what they think rates are in the market. But you choose them, you go to the marketplace, and you utilize their desk and get the best rates that their desk, right, can get you on that day. After kind of reviewing this with staff, we've decided that, because of the high rating of the city, it's a very straightforward structure, that a competitive sell makes a lot of sense here. And so what's the difference? In a competitive sell, we're not going to hire the underwriter until the end. So very similar to other processes, right? The city goes through, you guys get, bids for things on various projects, and then you pick the best bid. And that's effectively what we're doing here, right? So we're putting all this information together. There'll be what's called a notice of sell, which outlines the parameters, the bidding parameters for your bonds, and that'll go to the marketplace. And we'll take that to the marketplace on the 29th. on a platform called Parity, which is kind of the national platform for selling competitive municipal issues. And we'll take bids, and we'll take bids at 9:30 a.m. Mountain Time on the 29th. And then that right-hand side, you can kind of see the list. That's kind of the results, right? And so once the time has expired and they can't enter bids anymore, it brings up the list of firms nationally, right, that have bid on your bonds, and it ranks them. And so that you see that thing that's called TIC. That's just lingo for, in our marketplace, for interest rate. So effectively, whoever provides you the lowest interest rate, which includes their underwriting cost for delivering the debt, is the one we choose on that day, and they become, the underwriter of your bonds. And so that final 2 weeks, we'll work with them to kind of finalize this. The other interesting thing about a competitive sale is, because we're not vetting the underwriters up front, and most of these people we know who they are. I mean, we know who JP Morgan Series are, we know who TD Securities are, but occasionally there's a name that comes up that we haven't heard of before. One of the requirements of a competitive sale is that we have what's called a good faith deposit. What that means for the city is that the winning bidder or the winning underwriter has to provide 1% of the proceeds up front to you before we do any other paperwork or closings. And it's like a security deposit, right, for you guys. So if for some reason, right, the underwriter doesn't perform, which has never happened in my 20-year career, but if it doesn't, you guys in that notice of sale have the right to maintain and keep those funds, right, and go back out to the marketplace. And it's really just meant to kind of offset any losses, like if rates have gone up or anything else that the city may occur. So we'll have that in place. So we'll do a final review of the pricing. There'll be a verbal award, and then there's something called a terms certificate that, again, your bond counsel will prepare for you that will be signed. And what that term certificate is that we've met the parameters, again, of that ordinance that we've kind of set out, and the council has provided to us to execute on this pricing. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can kind of see the big buckets, right, of markets and buyers for these types of bonds, right? And, individuals are a big investor. Now, they don't necessarily buy them direct. They usually do it through like Charles Schwab or some other firm, but they're big buyers in the marketplace of bonds. Kind of the next big institutions are mutual funds, and then you kind of have banking institutions, insurance companies, and then we kind of have this other category, which are kind of what we call ARB accounts and other types of accounts that come in and buy bonds. And so, these are kind of the big. There'll be lots of institutionals, investors purchasing the city's bonds on this. All right, a couple more slides, and then I'll stand for any more questions or any questions that the council may have for me. So I wanted to just quickly update you guys on rates and then talk about where we are in terms of the cost of the debt from a snapshot perspective for the city. So this points out a couple things. One, looking back at the election date, when you ran your election numbers on November 7th, in that top graphic, interest rates kind of across the curve at a 20-year debt was about 403. And April 5, when we kind of updated this, we were at 346. So rates were down, right? Rates were coming down, but we're starting to see those things creep back up. So we'll keep an eye on that in terms of what we think the impact ultimately will be. But again, rates have come down. You have some room to run in terms of rates coming back to what you originally told investors you thought the estimate might be. The other thing to kind of note on the yield curve piece of this is that we have a partially inverted yield curve. So the benefit to the city is that short-term rates are really, really high right now, and they're higher than some of the midterm rates that you see on the market, and they're only a little bit lower than longer-term rates. And the benefit to the city is that you get those proceeds. We know that there's a schedule, right, and a time frame for which you're going to spend those out. And that means you can invest those proceeds, and you can invest those at a much higher rate or almost at what you borrowed at for the time that they're sitting there. That becomes additional project proceeds, right? So that helps with any cost overruns or other things that the city may have, unexpected costs, while you're building the project. And so That's a benefit we haven't really seen in our industry probably since, I would say, '06, '07. Typically, you see more of a normal yield curve, which means short-term rates are really, really low, long-term rates are long or high. So kind of a unique opportunity with the bond sale on this one. So kind of starting to wrap this up a little bit here. This is another graphic on interest rates. And really what I want to point out here is that, again, rates kind of had that big dive earlier in the year, or kind of the end of last year. And yeah, they're starting to creep back up, but we're still in a relatively good position. We're certainly at the higher side of the last, decade or so of rates. That bottom graph, the way to read that is those gray bars represent the lowest rate and the highest rate for each one of those maturities, right, from 1 year to 30 years since 2012. The green is the average over that time period, and the blue shows you where we're at today. So again, if you look at the short term of that curve, you can see how much higher short-term rates are today, which is, again, where you would invest your proceeds. And then as you get out longer on the curve, yeah, they're a little bit higher, but they're not much higher than the average when you get out to the longer side of the curve. So again, graph just kind of meant to be a little bit of provide some perspective on interest rates. So from an impact perspective, a couple things I want to talk about. One is we're not going to sell everything. And so the reason for that, and you might think, well, wait a minute. You said that we could earn all this money if it's sitting there, and that's true, but there are some IRS rules too that are kind of in place. One of those rules is kind of what's the expectation that you can spend the funds, right? And there's effectively two projects here. One project that's really ready to go, the other project not quite ready to go yet. And because we don't know what that time frame is, we're going to hold off on those proceeds and come back later and sell those when the city is ready to kind of start that project and kind of meet those reasonable expectations. And so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to sell 12 million, and I'll show you how we get from 11,155,000 and still deliver 12 million in proceeds from a bond sale. But again, if you compare the interest rates, had they been both 17.3, the original thought that it'd be 3.95%. Right now, we're going to be at 3.5%, 20 years on 12 million. So yes, tax impact is going to be lower. One, because we're not selling everything right now, and we have lower interest rates, and so you can kind of see what that comparison looks like. We originally were thinking cost 13 cents per 1,000. We're going to be at 9 cents. That means you have 4 cents left to sell the rest of the debt, and still, it's not a hard number, but I think it's always good to try to hopefully come in right where we thought we might come in when we put the election ordinance together. And so this just kind of gives you some comparison on this. And so interest cost estimated on 12 million, we'd be about 4.8 million with about a payment of 844,000. So, and then you can kind of read the bottom part of that in terms of what does that mean in terms of impact on homeowners. The other thing that we're going to do with this bond sale is that the first interest payment won't be right away. And again, that's to provide time for the city to actually certify a tax, right? Because you can't certify your first levy until September for this. Collections coming in, well, will be remitted to the city in January and July of next year, right? So we want to make sure we're timing those payments. So your first payment won't be until next year when you actually have tax revenue on this. So last slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sources and uses of this bond deal. How do we get to 12 million? Number one, what are some of those fees that we're going to pay? Estimated underwriting costs, just how the source and uses can come together so the city is aware. So a couple things about bonds. One is municipal bonds typically sell, especially in this kind of a rising interest rate market, at a premium. So what does that mean? What that means is that there's a a market yield that the investor will earn, and then there's that coupon rate that we'll use. And those aren't going to be the same. So, for instance, let's say on a 5-year bond, we have a 5% what's called a coupon rate, right? Well, that 5% coupon rate is what the city pays back to the investor. But the rate of return is going to be less because for that $5,000 bond that they purchase, they're not going to pay the city $5,000. They're going to pay the city, let's say, $5,300 for that. But you don't have to pay that $300 back, right? That's additional proceeds. And it's because the investor has asked for a higher rate than today's market. And they do that because they want to protect themselves against rising rates. And so they have to compensate the city for doing that. So what happens then is under Idaho law, we can't issue more than what we're asking, right? Which is, the $12 million, and plus covering costs. And we can cover costs through that premium. And so what happens with the additional premium after we cover costs, right, is we reduce the par amount, right? And so the par plus that premium gets us to that $12 million project deposit that we're looking to get from this particular bond sale, covering issuance costs. We're projecting will be around $94,000 for this bond issue. Underwriting cost, again, that'll come through their bid, but that's still something that gets paid into the interest rate, which we think will be around $45,000 on this issue. And then we have this thing called a rounding amount. And really all that means is that municipal bonds are sold in $5,000 increments, right? So in order for me to get another $1,000, I got to set another $5,000 bond to get that $1,000, right? From a rounding perspective. So the net difference just goes back to the city on the borrowing. And at the bottom of this, you can see the different fees that are associated with this type of a bond financing. So bond counsel, we talked about, municipal advisor, us, preparation of the official statement, paying agent trustee, rating agency costs, and underwriter's discount. So again, the underwriter fee. So those are the fees that get paid out of the financing. So that's what I had to present to you guys. I just kind of wanted you guys to understand, the process, some of the terminology, how we're going to sell the city's bonds through a competitive sale, and be able to answer any questions the council may have for us in this process before we come back and actually ask for an action item on this.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you so much. Is there any questions from council?
Mr. Mayor.
Sodick.
I'm from the old Dun and Bradstreet days, so forgive me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that's okay.
Okay, first of all, on setting the interest rates, obviously the buyer would like the highest rate, the city would like the lowest rate. Is that correct? Because
Correct.
of the payment
Yep.
schedule. How do you negotiate through that process relative to getting the best deal for the city, yet, satisfying the buyer?
Yeah. Well, again, so there would have been two different ways to do that, right? So they, through a competitive sale, that's the underwriter, right? So the underwriter has the pressure on them to deliver the lowest rate if they want to win the bonds, right? And so they have to go out and negotiate with their investors and figure out where the market's at, how far they can push those rates down, and then ultimately provide a bid, right? And so 7, 8, 9 different underwriters are going to be doing the same thing and having those conversations with their clients. It's like, hey, how low can we go on this? And so the nice thing about a competitive sale is that's what's helping you drive and know that you're getting that lowest rate, because you're making those banks compete, right? Those investment banks compete for your business on this. And so they're incentivized, if they want the bonds to sell to their investors, to give you that lowest rate. If it were a negotiated sale, it's a little different conversation, right? We would be going through the process with the underwriter as your advisor, looking at comparable sales in the marketplace, what that demand should be, and going through that process to make sure that we are advocating for you guys on the lowest rate.
Okay. On the underwriter side of this, how good is those bids active? In other words, do they give them 30 days and it changes, or 15 days, or is it variable every day?
Bids, markets are variable every single day. And so the way it works in a competitive sale, so bonds are a little different than some of your traditional financings, right? That when we get a bid that day and you sign a effectively what's going to be a notice to sell document saying, hey, we accept your bid, then it's locked. So you've locked your rates in. So from the time that we price the bonds and they've submitted bids, they have to hold those bids to you guys. And then so from there to closing and beyond, your rate is fixed at that point.
Okay. How much do the legal folks deal with our city legal folks? Is there any transparency there at all relative to what they're doing, or none at all?
There's some, they're very different realms, but absolutely there will be some opinions and things that will need to be signed by your councils. Some of those being like, you know, litigation, right? Is the city involved in any kind of litigation that we need to know about and disclose to investors, right? That may have a material financial impact, right, on the city. And so, yes, there is some interaction. Certainly, it depends on the client, right? How much you bring your counsel in to review documents. But again, a regular counsel doesn't know bond documents, you know, in particular. And you also have to remember that the bond counsel is on your side too. I mean, you've hired them as a special counsel to execute this on your behalf.
Well, like I say, if the city council is not, you know, well-rounded as far as educational process, in these, I would think there'd be the least amount of dialogue.
Yep, it's pretty limited. You know, they check in, like I said, on things that, from a due diligence perspective, that your counsel would understand and know about the city. But then, otherwise, it's just a very special, you know, type of counsel that's working on this.
On the urban renewal side of this thing, you folks look at that too. Can you give me some positive negatives on what urban renewal should have done or didn't do that would affect the rates?
Well, so different division of the city on this. Urban renewal bonds are interesting because, you know, they're a very, very different kind of credit on those.
Higher or lower? I mean, more.
They're higher, right? Because think about that, right? It's passive tax income that you're getting, right? You know, it's you as a city urban renewal are not in control of those tax rates. And as I know you guys have kind of gone through that process with a new urban renewal area, right? You're trying to project, well, what's that tax growth going to look like, right? And a lot of factors go into that in terms of what businesses, what depreciation they have, you know, and those valuations don't necessarily go up at the same rate, right, that the rest of the city valuations can go. And I'll give you an example. So we worked on, as a bank, as a lender, not as an advisor, on McCain-Dill in Burley, right? And so this was right before we had these big market run-ups that we had, that we kind of saw across the state. The challenge there is, again, those commercial properties weren't going up at the same pace, right? They're not as transparent. They don't get valued the same way, and it kind of depends on how the assessor looks at all these different businesses and assess those. While home values have all this data, right, in terms of how they're going. So what happens with that, right? Market values go up, tax rates come down, right? Now you've got lower tax rates against your urban renewal, which means your income goes down, and you have no way to kind of increase those. So it's those risks and URAs that make borrowing more expensive, and not always a good market bond, depending on how established the URA is.
So bad investments on the urban renewal side could affect the bond percentage, couldn't it not?
Well, if you defaulted on an URA bond, that would be very specific to the URA. It would actually be the same way. I mean, you know, if the city defaulted on revenue bonds relative to its water and sewer system, again, even though it's the city of Caldwell that issued that debt, those would come from enterprise funds, right, versus geo debt, right? Geo tax debt, you could, like, the city could still go out and get a good rating, and you would have different ratings. So that's the other interesting thing about this, right? If we were to go to Moody's with urban renewal debt or even water and sewer debt, you would have different ratings on those, right? Because, again, kind of what I talked about in my earlier presentation, that different sources of funds, right? Unlimited tax versus revenue versus kind of this passive TIF, you know, revenue income, and all get looked at differently.
The last question is on the spending proceeds from the bond itself to the city. What kind of restrictions do we have on that, on any money that we make off the bond? You know?
So I do. I can comment on that. So here's how the IRS looks at that, right? So there's a couple big restrictions on that. One is anything you earn off of those proceeds have to become project proceeds, meaning that you can't spend it off and spend it somewhere else in the city, right? They have to actually be spent on the project. So that's number one. Number two, there are yield restrictions called arbitrage yield. And so what does that mean? What that means is that the IRS is telling the cities like, hey, look, we're giving you guys a deal by allowing you guys to issue tax-exempt debt, right? And so we want to have some control over how much you earn. Because if you were talking about, earlier days in the marketplace. Well, if you go back to like the 70s and 80s, right, when there was these high inflation, before they had some of these rules in place, well, cities could issue more than they needed, right, in tax-exempt debt, bank that $10 million extra, let's say, in an account. And if you could earn 10% off of that and you're only paying 8% in tax-exempt, why wouldn't you do that, right? Because you're more than covering your debt and you've got some additional, benefit. So the IRS has what's called a bond yield, arbitrage yield, that gets calculated at the time that we issue the debt. That becomes the cap. And we'll help the city navigate that. Because there's some additional rules, like you can earn more and then you can blend it down. If you earn more, there's a period in which you have to do that calculation. So what does that mean? It just means you have to rebate it back to the IRS. You're not in trouble. It's just you don't get to keep it. And so what we'd like to do is navigate that with the city and say, okay, before we spend all the money, right, let's make sure we're doing those calculations so that it's not coming from the city budget, right? It's coming from the project budget before we do that. And we can help navigate that.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. My pleasure.
Any other questions? Okay, very good. Well done,
Okay.
Councilor Stodic and Walkover. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council members. I appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys and present to you this evening, and look forward to working on this and getting it to completion. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Raylan, did you have anything else, or Chief Frawley, that you wanted to add, or? Okay, very good. Thank you again. Appreciate you being here.
You bet.
Okay, that'll end this workshop. We will reconvene at 6 p.m. for a regularly scheduled city council meeting.